want to thank the organizers and Shoba Bandirao, the organizing committee, Herman Haller for his very nice words. I hope that I deserve them. And so I start this this talk. As Shoba said, whenever you want to ask anything, please ask it without problems. Well, the relation between historical linguistics and linguistic typology is not a hot topic, as it used to be called in the 70s or even a couple of decades ago. Today is not as investigated as it used to be. This is a good moment, I guess, in order to reflect on two labels, historical linguistics and linguistic typology. What is meant by historical linguistics and what is meant by linguistic typology? Instead of historical linguistics, is spreading diachronic linguistics, diachrony, as in a label interchangeable with historical linguistics, that is also interchangeable with historical sociolinguistics. But are they really synonyms with each other? This is a quotation from In Original. It was written originally in Italian by Nigel Vincent, one of the most renowned formal linguists. Cosa intendo per linguistica diacronica? What do I mean by linguistic diachrony, by diachronic linguistics? Intendo l'applicazione dei metodi della linguistica teorica a problemi di cambiamento linguistico. I intend the application, I mean the application of methods of theory, of the linguistic theory, whatever. He works in the lexico with excuse me, since the screen is totally occupied by the slides, I can hear a bell. Is anybody who wants to ask or anything going on?
Shoba, you're on mute.
Yeah.
Can you hear?
You can ignore that
Can you...
because when someone comes in,
okay, I'm
yeah,
sorry.
Joining Zoom,
okay.
Yes.
Okay, you are listening to me, right?
Yes, and I will let you know if there's a question. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, this is the application of methods of linguistic theory to problems of linguistic change, and on the contrary, the use of diachronic data of change, to highlight theoretical questions. So you see that the linguistica diacronica, diachrony, almost exclusively, and I would say exclusively, illustrates formal aspects of language. Is a formal way of thinking of linguistics. Obviously, this is the basic meaning of linguistic diachrony or diachronic linguistics. If you accept that it can be a synonym with historical linguistics, the scenario changes, obviously. But as this concern historical sociolinguistics, and is taken by two famous practitioners of historical sociolinguistics. As a sociolinguistic specialization, historical sociolinguistics has followed the overall trend of sociolinguistics at both the macro and the micro level. I would like to highlight the point I emphasized. Her approach was theory-oriented. I mean, Suzanne Romain's socio-historical linguistics, who was a seminal study. Her approach was theory-oriented and less concerned with reconstructing the social world in which the 16th century Scott text she analyzed had been produced. So you see that historical sociolinguistics is strictly as social, belongs to the domain of social history, I would say. And this is a crucial part, a quintessential part of what historical sociolinguistics is. Historical linguistics, on the other hand, as as you see, I'm trying to give some passages, some quotations taken from the most relevant, in my opinion, contributions to the topic I'm trying to deal with. According to Paul Kiparsky, the most visible face of historical linguistics is the study of language relationships. It has been revitalized in the last few decades by a wealth of new linguistic, historical, anthropological, and genetic evidence, innovative methods of classifications, and a better understanding of how languages disperse and change. So you see language dispersions and change. This is interesting, and we'll see that other scholars have similar thoughts. There are two different approaches to historical linguistics, therefore. One is the reconstruction of unattested stages of a language or a linguistic family. And it is a movement backwards in a way. This is mainly, let's say that Indo-European linguistics is a typical case of reconstruction in this sense, or investigation on the development of a language, or less frequently of a linguistic family, over time. And this is a movement, let's say, forwards. Silvia Luraghi, who is a representative of the mainstream of the relation between typology and historical linguistics, has written a contribution in the important volume handbook, the Cambridge Handbook of Linguistic Typology. And often papers devoted to this topic, the relation between typology and historical linguistics, virtually limit the discussion to possible contributions of language typology to language construction. But the difference, I'm quoting from the end of the quotation, the difference is more a matter of focusing on either issue. However, focusing one's attention either on reconstruction or on language change has different implication as to the way in which the two fields of language typology and historical linguistics can relate to each other. When another mention of the relation between linguistic typology, and it's interesting, I'm quoting from two Italian scholars whose education was in Italy. Linguistic typology can tell us whether there is any limitation to the combination of features, whether there are hierarchies regulating cross-linguistic variation in the relevant domains, and whether some combinations are impossible or at least highly unlikely. But I'm quoting what I emphasized, the first principle to follow if typologists and historical linguists are to do joint work is to share definitions. And this is not a trivial matter. And it is not, in fact. Because sometimes people use the same label to envisage or identify different things, different objects, which require different methodology. This is a quotation from Michael Weiss about the comparative method. Michael Weiss is a famous Indo-Europeanist, and he simply says that the comparative method is the systematic process of reconstructing the segmental and suprasegmental inventory of an ancestral language from cognate reflexes in the genetically related daughter languages. Probably instead of genetically, today genealogically related would be better. Anyway, fortunately, the comparative method allows us to reach much greater time depths and reconstruct ancestral languages that existed thousands of years before the advent of writing. I mentioned these words because they, how can I say, there is optimism in this perspective, probably a lot of optimism. I'm not, okay, there is a lot of optimism in these words. Let's go back to historical sociolinguistics. We saw that it was theory-oriented, but in the most recent handbook of historical sociolinguistics, there is this quotation, the initial quotation from page 1. Over the last 3 decades, research in the history of languages has been significantly refreshed, not only because new methodologies have developed within linguistics at large, but also because the systematic application of their tenets and tools has often uncovered new aspects to be analyzed and interpreted. This is the case of historical sociolinguistics, a hybrid subfield subsisting on the interdisciplinary character of sociolinguistic methodology, whose original goal was, in the words of Susan Romain, to provide an account of the forms and uses in which variation may manifest itself in a given community over time. And please pay attention to the word variation. As a result, the scope of the discipline has widened. The discipline is obviously historical sociolinguistics, has widened beyond the study of variation and change to cater for rather micro sociolinguistic facets, macro sociolinguistic facets such as multilingualism, language content, attitudes to language, and standardization, so that a broader definition of historical sociolinguistics as the reconstruction of the history of a given language in its sociocultural context is, in its simplicity, far more inclusive. So you see that there is a huge, a big component of social facts, external factors that are crucial, that belongs to the way in which historical sociolinguistics is thought, is conceived. We move to linguistic typology. In my opinion, I conclude what I think about. I think that this is my basic thought about labels. I think that historical linguistics should be enough. It's a self-contained label. I would use diachrony exclusively when I have to do with formal aspects of reconstruction, formal aspects of the language, whereas I would use historical sociolinguistics if I want to stress the social factors, the external factors. Diachrony, probably internal factors. Historical sociolinguistics, the social factors, the external factors. even though what is internal, what is external, it's it's an issue in itself. It's not always easy to distinguish what is internal and what is external. But this is another issue. What is meant by typology? Even in this case, there are different viewpoints. I take this one from the most recent, to the best of my knowledge, Handbook of Linguistic Typology, the one edited by Alexander Heichenwald and Robert Dixon. Linguistic typology as a discipline is all-embracing. Its subject matter is a rigorous scientific investigation of cross-linguistic variation in every domain of language, and thus of the limits and of the possibilities of human language. I move to the emphasized part. Typology is central for inductively based cross-linguistic generalization. So the inductive methods. It is a testing ground for any theoretical statement about what a language or a language feature may be like. Typological generalization based on good quality, reliable sources. And I emphasize this point because sometimes, this is not my opinion, but the opinion of people who review article, papers, contribution, sometimes the sources are not very good and not very reliable. In any case, typological generalization based on good quality, reliable sources help predict what is more likely and what is less likely to occur in a language. Ideally, typology goes hand in hand with explanation, why the language is the way it is. Goes hand in hand with explanation. But the force of typology is hardly able to explain personal opinion. Another contribution this is the Cambridge Handbook, the one from which I took the passage from Eichenwald and Dixon. The competitor, the handbook, the Oxford Handbook of Linguistic Typology, includes an interesting chapter of Michael Daniel, or Michael Daniel, in which there are some interesting, is an interesting chapter, thoughts-provoking. Linguistic typology compares languages to learn how different languages are, to see how far these differences may go, and to find out what generalization can be made regarding cross-linguistic variation. I move to the end. Although rarely referring to them directly, so to a single language, they are all based on ideas about the structure of human language, often projected from Latin grammars, implicitly suggesting parallels between different languages. Yet these approaches are not typological, because they focus on one language, even when they borrow meta-language applied to a different linguistic system. The difference between, and this is another quotation from Daniel, the differences between linguistic typology and historical linguistics lie in the final objectives of their diachronic commitments. In that comparative linguistics established genealogical relationships between languages and thus sheds light on the history of the specific speech communities. Whereas sociolinguistics, in quotation, sociolinguistics originated as a new approach to the study of the mechanisms of language change. You see that change and variation as synonyms continue to occur. The focus is on the way innovation spread within the language community and how several communities may linguistically influence each other. Among other things, this focus provides additional information on the history of ethnic groups, complementing that coming from comparative research. But this is an application, not the true objective of the method. third quotation from this chapter. Typology of language change is a totally different enterprise and does not rely on the actual timeline. The scope of the typological interest is universal laws of how elements in a linguistic system, or the system itself, develop over time. What kind of shift may or may not happen independently of the actual mechanism of change, in the sense of innovation spread in the speech community and the time it took place. You see, there is an integration of internal and external factors, in a way, in this contribution by Daniel. But even, this is the last quotation from Daniel, but even such diachronic typologies are essentially synchronic by virtue of their method, as they are primarily based on observing various stages of linguistic change in the present-day population of languages. At the end of the quotation, the possible solution would be to limit typological research to a period of time in which language evolution was negligible for its purposes. I don't like very much evolution for some personal reasons. I would prefer development, but this is Daniel's viewpoint. But then we do not exactly know what period this is, and it is possible that this period varies depending on the specific research domain. So there is an opposition between historical linguistics and typology. It's not an opposition, a strong opposition. It's different, but they can combine through a social, ethnographic, anthropological analysis of the data. Since aerial linguistics, contact languages, languages in contact, are labels that are often invoked in both in historical linguistics and typology. I would like to quote from the contribution of one of the leading figures in the field of aerial linguistics, Thomas Stolz, who wrote in 2006, "Aerial linguists must be versed not only in contact linguistics, but also in linguistic typology and universals research, cultural history of the particular region under scrutiny, descriptive grammar and national philology of the individual languages involved, diachronic grammar, both general and language specific, and last but not least, the principles of dialectology, linguistic geography." This is, of course, a rather challenging and demanding combination for the individual researcher, who is therefore well advised to associate with a team of like-minded fellow researchers. On a teamwork basis, one may tackle the frequently asked questions of contact linguistics. So, aerial linguistics is a tricky subfield of linguistics, but this is the topic for another talk. Uniformitarian principle is also being frequently invoked by practitioners of historical linguistics. I take the quotation from a famous paper by Peter Trudgill. "One of the bases of historical linguistics is the uniformitarian principle. Knowledge of processes that operated in the past can be inferred by observing ongoing processes in the present." This leads us to the methodological principle of using the present to explain the past. This chapter presents a sociolinguistic typological perspective. You see, we start with the historical linguistics and we end up with sociolinguistic typological perspective
Mhm.
that should be that should highlight historical linguistics. This chapter presents a sociolinguistic typological perspective which investigates the extent to which it is possible to produce sociolinguistic explanations for linguistic structures. I have some doubts of the application of the uniformitarian principles to the historical linguistics. I have tried somewhere else to say why. I don't want to delve into this thorny issue. And I always think that it should be a good thing to uh, not to forget that the uniformitarian principle did not originate in linguistics, but in the natural sciences, in geology to be precise. One of the earliest studies come from James Hutton, Scottish geologist, but the principle itself was mainly made famous by Sir Charles Lyell with his influential and very popular principles of geology. One should not forget, however, that some traces of the idea can also be found outside geology, as in David Hume's treatise on human nature. In his treatise, he is rather critical of the idea that the laws of nature do not change. And I also doubt that the way of thinking of mankind, of the human beings, did not change over time. But this is a too too complicated, too complex issue. So I leave it apart. These quotations are taken from, and I'm moving rapidly to the second part, where I try to illustrate two examples of when historical linguistics and typology seem to collide. Alteration of syntactic patterns takes place by means of specific mechanisms of change. This is taken from historical syntax and cross-linguistic perspective. In a way, cross-linguistics is a mild way to say in typological perspective. This is it's not Alice Harris and Lyle Campbell way of thinking. This is what I draw, the conclusion I draw from reading their volume, their very interesting volume. We hypothesize that there are only three basic mechanisms: reanalysis, extension, and borrowing. You see this what is curious, at least, or even puzzling, in my opinion, in this book is the fact that there is a combination of formal perspective, a diachronic perspective, with things that are sociolinguistic in nature, that are purely historical, that belong to a purely historical linguistics. I quote this. This quotation is simply to say that, according to these authors, these scholars, language contact is a situation. The term borrowing means a mechanism of change, and this is interesting and provides uh, other perspectives, other viewpoints on commonly used labels. This is again from our purposes in this section. Historical syntax is the title of this volume. To present aspects of the comparative method that can be successfully applied to syntax to describe positive aids to syntactic reconstruction. Relics or archaisms are held by many scholars to be perhaps the single most useful source of evidence for syntactic reconstruction. reconstruction is used for unattested stages of language and for attested, even attested stages of language. Hawke, another famous practitioner of historical linguistics, diachronic linguistics, assert this strongly. The traditional approach, with its emphasis not aberrant, archaic patterns, can be applied without circularity. It yields more satisfactory results than an approach which focuses on the synchronically most regular pattern. This is Mayet's famous dictum that we reconstruct on exceptions, not on rules. So relics and quotation relics have two essential properties. They are exception in another ways, otherwise regular system, and two, they are archaic. Some ways to determine relics that are sometimes suggested in the literature are the following. An archaism normally recedes over a period of time, whereas an innovation spreads. Relics often occur in the most commonly used expression of a language. Relics, this is Mayet, relics are likely to be preserved in province and proverb-like sayings. Well, I've tried to give you a picture of different voices that are echoing when you try to combine historical linguistics and typology. A couple of examples that are interesting. I hope, since I do not see any watch around me, Shoba, how many minutes do I have?
You're on mute.
It is 11:40 now. So another 10, 15 minutes, that's...
10 minutes is fine.
Or even 15 minutes is okay
15,
too.
let's say
Yeah.
15, okay. When historical linguistics and typology collide, two examples. One is taken from Proto-Indo-European, the subsystems of stops, the plosives. This is the reconstructed system of stops in Indo-European. This is the reconstructed system. Bilabial, dental, palatal, velar, labiovelar. As you see, you have voiceless, voiced, aspirated. In 1957, Roman Jakobson, or in Russian, Roman Jakobson, criticized as typologically inconsistent this system, this subsystem of the phonological system of Indo-European. This should be the typological consistent system of stops. It should include the voiceless aspirated, but no language offered only in the Old Indic. We have some traces of this voiceless aspirated. They do not occur. They are a problem. We are applying the methods of the correct methods of reconstructing the Indo-European phonological system, but voiceless aspirated stops cannot be reconstructed. What to do? Such an implication of typology, voiceless, voiced implies voiceless. Voiced aspirated implies voiceless aspirated. This is the implicational hierarchy. The implicational typology was already developed in Jakobson's investigation on the acquisition of sound by the child and the loss of sound by aphasics, which indeed arrived at formulating some universal rules of the implicational form. This was during the 40s, result achieved by Roman Jakobson. There are three solutions have been proposed. Solution one. The reconstructed system is correct in the sense that there are other languages in which this system occurs. And this system has been reckoned, it's the phonological system of Kelabit. Kelabit is notable for having a typological rare series of true voiced aspirates, that is not ready voice, murmured consonant. For some speakers, they are pre-voiced, but they are reconstructed voiced aspirates, along with modally voiced and tenuis voiceless consonants, but without an accompanying series of voiceless aspirates. It is the only language known to have voiced aspirates or murmured consonants without also having voiceless aspirated consonants, a situation that has been reconstructed for Proto-Indo-European. These words are a reformulation of what Robert Blast, the most famous specialist of Kelabit, claimed. So there is no problem in the end. This is a system that also occurs in at least in one other language in the world, among the world's languages. Solution two. Gankrelidze Ivanov reformulated it as glottalic, according to so-called glottalic theory, a theory that nowadays nobody seems to accept. So it's, in a way, as I tried to demonstrate some years ago, it's a way of representing the system of stops. It doesn't concern the sounds themselves. This is the second solution. So if you change the representation and the chronological depth of that representation, things are fine. The situation is okay. The third solution, sorry, non-solution, is taken from the Introduction to Indo-European Linguistics by James Clarkson. It's time to seek a reconstruction of the stop series that combines the diachronic explanatory power of the traditional model, while seeking to explain the apparent markedness of the D series, the voiced aspirate series, the voice series and the voiceless aspirate. There is a growing awareness among phoneticians of the complexity of different stop systems. And there are increasing numbers of languages which offer stop series not easily described, simply in terms of opposition, such as voiced, unvoiced, aspirated, unaspirated, and glottalic, pulmonic. So probably a more fine-grained features, phonological features, could provide a solution. This is what Clarkson invokes. Do I have a personal answer? No, I have no answer. I don't want to give an answer to this problem. But probably there is something else that must be done. And the situation as it is represented is insufficiently clear. This is my opinion. The second case is concerns the comparative constructions, the typology of the comparative construction. I take this from the relatively old volume by Leon Stassen, the late Leon Stassen. This book is still the best description, as far as I know, of the comparative constructions in the world's languages, among the world's languages. A comparative construction is a construction in the natural language, counts as a comparative construction, and will therefore be taken into account in the typology if that construction has the semantic function of assigning a graded that is non-identical position on a predicative scale to two possibly complex objects. You see, this time you have positive, equative, superior, comparative, inferior, comparative, superlative, relative, and excessive. Bernheine, cognitive foundations of grammar. We can identify 5 elements. The comparee, in John is more intelligent than George. John is the comparee. More is the parameter marker. Clever is the parameter. Then is the pivot, and George is the standard, the entity, that the person that is taken as the standard and establishes the point of reference. 6 types of comparative constructions have been identified among the world's languages. The allative comparative, as in present, we done, for me, to me, literally. The locative comparative, from Tamazi, fully means upon me, or you have at me, or something like that. The separative comparative, from Mundari, Sadomete Hati Manangai, horse from, the elephant is bigger than the horse. From the horse, the elephant is big. The surpass, exceed comparative. In Douala, this house, it big, exceed that. This house is bigger than that. Conjoined comparative, the first type. This is taken from Papua New Guinea, Tobon. This big, this small. But there is conjoined comparative too. Strong I, strong he. Third person singular. I and no. He's stronger than me, than I. And particle comparative. Istvan Mogashov means better. Istvan is taller than mean better. If we try to provide a typological sketch of Latin, what do we have? In Latin, and I also wrote in red the type of constructions which occur in Latin, we have the conjoined comparative of type 1. Tu fortunatus, ego miser. You're luckier than I am. The type of expression with na, I'm quoting from the bottom, from the paper from Paul Anderson. The type of expression with na is, technically speaking, an example of comparison expressed through juxtaposition and not through particle. And secondly, this type of comparison with na is not attested in the Rig Veda and has not been found in Old Indic. So it seems to be recent, but I guess that is not simply not attested, because probably it was of low level. This is an open question and I want to go into it, but you have example from Ramayana, and this is a late example. Varam martyur nachakrti. Death is better, varam martyum, than dishonor. Preferable, varam martyur, not nachakrti, not dishonor. In Latin, this type seems as undoubtedly a comparative. The development of patterns where the pivot coincides with or related to the negation is found in numerous Indo-European languages. For instance, in the oldest records of the Baltic languages, especially in Old Lithuania. This pattern probably ceased to be productive and to be felt as a type of comparative already at the time of plotters. 3rd, 2nd century BCE. Thereafter, the juxtaposition of two antithetic terms was only one of the many stylistic devices with which Latin authors embellished their prose or verse. It can be considered a relic, and is based on relic that the practitioner of historical linguistics, as you remember, can reconstruct. Separative comparative. Non necessaire speio hoc ablative. Qui sono est me, again ablative, which expressed the separation from this, from me. Melle dulci dulcior is probably a case of elativity, not a true comparative. But this is another point that would deserve a talk, another talk. So I don't go, but the separative comparative, in Plautus, the separative comparative occurs 75 times, covering 5 domains. Negative sentence, this is taken from Syntactica, famous, still one of the most important books on Latin syntax ever written. On negative sentence, rhetorical questions with negative presuppositions, formal expression with proverb or metaphorical sentences, formal expressions with plus, minus, and numerical expressions. There is a detailed analysis of this type of construction. Particle comparative, peior quam, worth than. There is no one worse as a liar and a man anywhere in the world than my master, no one so foul and covered with dirt. Quamelus meus et nequetam luteus, nequetam caeno conlicus. So, peior quam. The common opinion is supported by Hoffman and Santi that this way, this construction Ausdruckweise is secondary, is not original. This type, according to Hoffman and Chantier, would be a contamination of hic est tam doctus quam ille, comparative equality, as wise as he is, as wise as the other is, hic est doctio illo, with the separative. This explanation, however, is too simplistic for at least 2 reasons. First, the example I quoted, the examples with separative, excuse me, does not by itself seem to support the origin of the pattern as a mixture of 2 other patterns logically preceding it. Second, and more important, since even in Greek the standard can be expressed by a particle, a functionally corresponding to quam, and in other Indo-European languages like Germanic were then developed, it is more reasonable to think that this pattern should not be ascribed to Proto-Indo-European and could develop independently and along different paths. Exceed, surpass comparative. This type is also sed priamus hic multo illi prestat. Prestat is far superior to that one, illi. Well, this type is also found in some of the oldest Indo-European languages, such as Vedic and Homeric Greek. The idea that in Latin, possibly going back to the Proto-Indo-European, Plautus' example is an instantiation of a pattern with comparative function, that is, a Latin means of expression of comparison alongside the separative and particle comparatives, though fully accepted, was only recently taken into consideration in grammars. This is why school handbooks and grammars do not always refer to this construction as a comparative one. So, since I'm moving to the conclusion, the conclusion, how would a typologist react to the fact that in Latin you have 4 constructions out of 6? I don't know. but I know how a practitioner of historical linguistics reacts. He would take into account only the separative comparative, because the conjoint comparative is probably out of the system for the native speaker of Latin. It was not any longer a way of making a comparison. It's a residual, it's a relic, but it existed in an old stage of Latin. It would take into account the separative comparative, because it's all the very, very frequent is the usual way of making a comparison, and the particle comparison. And probably would exclude also the exceed comparative, because this exceed or surpass comparative was probably intended to be the fact that it compares, this construction makes a comparison, is an inference, is an inferential, probably. But this, I am not aware of any reliable investigation on this construction in Latin. And this is a desideratum of the in Latin linguistics. Provisional conclusion, some provisional conclusion. I'm aware of their probably they are not, they can be discussed. Historical linguistics is as much a historical discipline as it is a linguistic one, and should be carefully distinct from diachrony, with which it's not always, I'm not saying is not interchangeable, is not always interchangeable. Typology is not a theory of language. It describes and classifies languages according to some principles elaborated within some theoretical framework. This is a reason why, I guess, Alexander Eichenwald and Bob Dixon used the image goes hand in hand with historical linguistics. It's not the same. Combining typology and historical linguistics can give interesting results, but typology hardly provides the keys to interpret linguistic changes and to be the key for a new historical linguistics, at least for the time being. We have to deepen some theoretical and methodological points. Final, also for the time being, when results achieved by means of typology do not coincide with the data provided by historical linguistics, the reliability of the latter should probably prevail over the former, at least for the time being. Thank you very much for your attention and for your patience.